I can't wait to, she's not.
All right, good morning. So today, it's supposed to be live. I'm gonna make sure that the audio is actually on before I launch into the substance. Let's see if I can just, sounds like we have audio, so that's good. All right, so today we're going to talk about employee responsibilities in the workplace. For every right that you have, you probably also have corresponding responsibilities. An example of that I'll give you is in the political marketplace, and I'm going to use this example today because as we've heard so many times over the past 6 years, we live in unprecedented times and we are facing unprecedented challenges as a nation. And so today, for the first time in history, something unprecedented is happening. And what is that unprecedented happening? Anybody know?
Trump.
Yeah, so for the first time in history, a president, he's not the first to have been arrested, by the way. Ulysses S. Grant was arrested for racing his horse through the streets of Washington when he was president of the United States. But for the first time in history, a president has been indicted and is being charged, and those charges will be revealed to him and the public, I believe, this afternoon. So from a political marketing standpoint, this is a huge area in the political marketing arena because Trump has used these charges to raise, since they were announced sometime last week, $7 million in fundraising. He's got Lindsey Graham out saying that we need to send money to the president so he can fight these charges. And he has in fact raised $7 million to fight those charges while he is traveling on a private jet from, this is not a political statement, this is a statement of fact, traveling on a private jet from Florida to New York to face the charges. I can tell you as an aircraft owner, so my airplane, just to give you some idea, frame of reference, my aircraft is a 2000 model 182S. It costs $375 an hour to operate my aircraft. It costs somewhere in the neighborhood of probably $25,000 to $50,000 an hour to operate Trump's aircraft. So, but he's raised $7 million to go towards that defense. What do you all think of that? We're talking about responsibilities today. The president or the former president used to be an employee of the American people. As president of the United States, he's an elected official. He's answerable to the public at large. It's the only office that is elected by all of the people, although not directly. We don't have anybody at the national level that's directly elected by all of the people. Congressmen represent districts and they represent certain numbers of people. Senators don't represent people, they represent states, although they are elected by the people in the states directly. That wasn't true for most of our country's history. They were elected by state legislatures, but the president was elected by all of the people. So we're talking about employee responsibilities. So in the political marketing place, this gives us an opportunity to talk about the responsibilities you have, I guess, as an elected official. But one of the things that we can think about is just in terms of voters. We say you have a right to vote. That also means that you have a responsibility to vote, right? You have this right. You should also exercise that right. You have a responsibility, a moral obligation. If you do not vote, we do not really have a democracy. But the elements of democracy that we do have themselves may fail if you don't exercise that responsibility, and if you don't exercise it in a fashion that is required of citizens. What is required of citizens when they go vote? Well, it should be that you are an informed electorate. Now, most people don't have time to think about that. They don't have the emotional energy to put it into really going and voting. I told you all that I serve on the city council of the city of Guthrie, Oklahoma. The first time I served on city council was 25 years ago when I was 25 years old. And that was the first time I was eligible to run, and I did. I had a greater impact. So I ran for city council 25 years ago as a 25-year-old person. I was following in my mother's footsteps. I had a greater impact on the daily lives of the citizens in my ward than the president of the United States did, and less than 100 people voted in that election, right? Less than 100 people vote. The city of Guthrie has about 12,000 people in terms of its population. At the time I ran for the first time, it was just about 10,000 people. We've grown slightly, but not as much as sort of South Logan County, and less than 100 people voted in those elections. And your city council people have a greater impact on your life every day than the president of the United States, because they're going to determine how much you pay for water. If you live in Edmond, they're going to determine how much you pay for electric. If you live in Edmond, they're going to determine how much you pay for sewage and things like that, right? Those are impacts on your lives every single month. And if you're a tenant, if you live in Edmond, for example, as a tenant, and you think, well, you know, if you live in some place that pays the water bill, well, ultimately that's figured into your rent. You know, so, you know, these things are important. So we have a right to vote. We also have a responsibility to vote. Employees have rights that we talked about. There are 3 types of rights we talked about last time: contractual, legal, which are obligations that are imposed by law, and then moral rights, and they overlap in many instances. You know, particularly when we talk about legal rights and ethical rights in the workplace. So let's talk a little bit about Enron. This is a case that almost everybody's heard about, and it's one of the reasons I still use this case for this chapter, is that this is one of the cases that led to my being able to teach this class. When I first started asking to teach courses in ethics, the dean of the college and the department chair at that time said, we need to have substantive skills that students can take and show to employers that they can do these things. One of the things as a professor of professional sales that I teach are practical skills that allow you to go out in the workforce and obtain a job, as demonstrated by things like going to sales competitions and winning. And students that go to sales competitions and win get job offers. Cooper can attest to that, right? Like, you go to a competition, you win, you get a job offer. You have multiple job offers. If you compete, and even if you don't win, one of the things that's nice about sales competitions, and I realized this the first time I went, the first competition I went to was years and years and years ago, and our students lost horribly. We were a program in its infancy, and the first competition I was sent to was ICSC, which was sort of, they call NCSC, which is the National Collegiate Sales Competition. They call that the Super Bowl of sales competitions, and ICSC, not to be outdone, says that they are the World Cup of sales competitions. And they really are. There's just an enormous amount of students that compete in them. But one of the things that happened that was nice is I took these students to ICSC. We got beat like a drum, and they still got a job. They still got job offers from that, even though they didn't do so well, because their skills were so much further advanced than students who don't have training in professional sales. So we teach substantive skills in that. And so when we look at ethics, the dean and the department chair, when I first started asking to teach this class, said things like, our students need those kinds of substantive skills, and ethics just doesn't provide it. And then we had this case, Enron. And all of a sudden, AACSB and everybody else started paying attention to ethics, and they started saying, maybe we should teach this course. And so I got to teach it because of this case. And so I still use this case when we talk about employee responsibilities. So at one time, Enron was the 7th largest corporation. They had shares valued at $90 a share. And on December 2nd, 2001, they filed for bankruptcy, and their shares were down to pennies on the dollar. And just they were delisted. They were a delisted stock. They were a natural gas pipeline company, an energy trading company, and they used an accounting firm called Arthur Andersen. And they created, as a result of this, special project entities which are off balance entities that they used to shift debt from Enron to these entities, and it was a house of cards. And when it fell, they collateralized these special project entities, which were off balance, with stock from Enron. And when it fell, people who were millionaires one day were not the next. And it was a result of colossal failures on the part of their employees. I've told you that corporations are people, right? And politicians get in trouble when they say things that are true. That's when they get in trouble. When they tell the truth, politicians get in trouble. So everybody laughed at Mitt Romney when they were questioning him about corporations and the rights corporations had under Citizens United. And he said, corporations are people, my friends. And everybody laughed. Corporations are people. They are legal people. Right? Everybody laughed at him. He was saying something that's true. The Supreme Court has said that corporations have First Amendment rights. They have free speech rights. And so we realize that corporations as a legal person are not actual people, and they act through their officers and directors and employees, their agents. And when those employees fail in their ethical duty and in their legal duties, as they did with Enron, when Ken Lay and Andy Fastow, who created these off-balance sheets and this house of cards, failed, the corporation failed, and people who had invested heavily in Enron in their 401ks, mostly the employees of the corporation who were relying on that, went from being millionaires one day to being broke the next and having to start all over. It's again, one of the reasons why I chose to be, unlike my mother, who is a serial entrepreneur, a state employee here at the University of Central Oklahoma, because I get something that it doesn't matter how much the stock market goes up or down. I will get a teacher's retirement, which is a defined benefit when I retire, which will pay me the same amount of money every month for the rest of my life until the day that I die. And if I'm married at the time, I can choose to take a slightly reduced benefit, and my spouse can continue to draw my teacher's retirement until the day she dies. Right? That's an incredible deal. That's one of the reasons I did this. But most people don't have that luxury. They invest, and most corporations, a lot of the things, for example, my brother works for Goldman Sachs, and a big portion of his 401k is invested in Goldman stock. And should Goldman fail, he might be, that's one of the ways the company funds his variable compensation plan, is through stock grants. And so these people lost everything. So what responsibilities do employees have to their employers, and what is it dependent upon? Well, one of the things that it's dependent upon is where you are in the corporation. Obviously, people like Ken Lay and Andy had much greater ethical obligations to the corporation and its shareholders and its employees and other people that benefit or rely on that corporation than someone who is, say, working on the assembly line or working on the pipeline that Enron owns. So it's dependent upon where you are in the corporation, what kinds of responsibilities that you're going to owe to the corporation. So what rights are we owed to others? Or rights are what is owed by others to us. Rights are what is owed by others to us, and our responsibilities are then what we owe to other people, right? So again, if we think about free speech rights, we have the right to free speech. One of the things that we have to recognize with that right is that if we exercise free speech, we should exercise it responsibly and also be aware that other people have the right to free speech, right? And in an era in which we can reach, as individuals, thousands of people, we have to think about that. Historically speaking, most individuals, our free speech rights didn't mean very much because we could only reach, the people that we could talk to. Whereas corporations had the ability to reach thousands of people through communications like advertising and promotion. But now, in an age of the internet, we have the ability to reach thousands of people, don't we? In our communication. We used to say in marketing that if a customer was really, really happy with you, when I first started teaching marketing years and years and years ago, before the internet was really popular, we would say that if a customer was really happy with you, they might tell 3 people about your product or service. If they were dissatisfied with you, if they didn't like you, they were likely to tell 7 people or more about your product or service. They were likely to engage in what we call NWOM. That's negative word of mouth. Now, if customers are displeased with you, who are they going to tell? Everyone. They're going to get on Yelp or TripAdvisor or Amazon, where they bought the product, and they're going to rate the product, and they're going to tell everyone. Now, the interesting thing about this is that one of the things Amazon realized was that even bad reviews can be helpful. Products with bad reviews sold more frequently than products with no reviews. So even negative word of mouth may be beneficial. So we have this right of free speech, but we have to respect other people's rights of free speech. And we also should use that speech responsibly. Again, in an age in which we can communicate with everybody, we can use free speech in very, very harmful ways. I've talked about ChatGPT in here. How many of you have used ChatGPT? Few of you. One of the things that we're able to do now is they're able to engage in sort of deep faking. And I told you all about one of the channels that I follow, which is Jolly, which are these 2 British guys that eat lots of food. I never thought it would be entertaining to watch people eat food, but there's these 2 little skinny British guys, and they eat massive amounts of food. And it's really, really funny. And the commentary that they provide, they take these, they're shoving it in their mouth. I have no idea. If I ate that much food, I would not be able to fit through the door. And, there would be lots of problems. But anyway, so in one of the episodes, Ollie deep fakes Josh, and he comes up with an avatar for Josh, and using artificial intelligence, he says, now we can create content without us having to actually film our show. And he did it sort of as a proof of concept, but we can do that now. And we're seeing this in the political marketing world. We're seeing people engaging in deep faking. So for example, taking Joe Biden as president, using creating an avatar basically for him, and then projecting him into things that he didn't say, and making him look as though, for example, that he's senile or that he's losing his mind, and we can deep fake that. So, and that's part of free speech, right? And so we have to think about these things. So what responsibility, even though we have this right of free speech, and even though businesses have a right, and acting through their agents and employees, they have a right to engage in things. What are the limitations on those? Can you engage in false or misleading advertising, for example, as part of your free speech rights? Historically speaking, we relied on a doctrine called caveat emptor, which was let the buyer beware in this country. And if you were stupid enough to buy the pill that the snake oil salesman was selling you, that was just your fault. We now have something called the FDA, which regulates that, so you can't sell stuff, which is why when they talk about all these vitamin supplements that they sell on television, and they're like, do you have a problem with memory? This is one of my favorite ones, is Prevagen. Using an element or a compound that was originally found in jellyfish, we're increasing your, and I'm thinking, if you think about this just rationally for a few minutes, what does the jellyfish have to do with good memory? Jellyfish are creatures that literally have no memory, right? They don't have like a brain. And yet, like, they're Prevagen using something found in jellyfish. What? Jellyfish are not like, overly sentient beings. But apparently, I guess it sounds exotic to say that. And maybe they did fine. I don't know. Maybe, but at the end of the ad, right, they say, this is not intended to treat, cure, or prevent any disease. Well, obviously it is. I mean, like, we're speaking out of both sides of it, because we have to put this disclaimer at the end that says the FDA has not approved this drug or has not approved this as a drug to treat, cure, or prevent any disease. And yet what they're saying basically throughout the ad is if you have memory problems, and as we engage in longer and longer life expectancies due to medical advancements, this becomes something that's really, really important for us. If you've ever known somebody who has suffered from Alzheimer's, it's a horrible disease to lose your mind. And so, they advertise this thing, and then of course they put the disclaimer at the end, and nobody actually listens to the disclaimer that they have to put at the end. But that's free speech, right? What kinds of responsibilities do we have? So the narrow view of responsibilities emerged at common law from what we call the principal agent or agency law. What is this agency law view of things? Well, agency is what allows us to have corporations be people or fictional people that have real rights, because we act as agents for the principal, which is the corporation. Historically, it allowed an individual to act on the part of another individual so that they didn't have to be there. If you owned a business, for example, historically that wasn't a corporation and you were a sole proprietor, you probably relied on other people. You can't do everything yourself. If we think about my family's own business, so we have my family owns this little bed and breakfast business in Guthrie. We've owned up to 7 bed and breakfasts at one point in time. My mother does this. She starts bed and breakfasts and then she sells them off. And we've had up to 7. She sold them. We're down to 2 right now. And she's itching to go out and buy more because we're booking, in advance. And so and I'm like, you're 73 years old. Can we not engage in buying more properties that require me to sit there and fix and paint and repair every weekend of my natural life for the rest of my life? Let's think about that. Let's not do that, right? But she wants to do this. So, but when you own a business, and you own 7 bed and breakfasts, even though it's a very small business, my mother couldn't do everything on her own, right? So she relied on agents like myself, for example, to go out and purchase supplies for the business. So I'm acting on behalf of my mother in purchasing supplies for the business. Well, what does that entail? Well, it entails, under the laws of agency, 3 sort of responsibilities that the agent has to the principal. So in agency law, you have a principal. This is the person or the business on whose part you act, or the entity on whose part you act. So for example, I am an agent of the University of Central Oklahoma. The University of Central Oklahoma is an entity owned by the state of Oklahoma, right? We are a state agency created under the state constitution, and I work for the entity. So I am an agent of UCO. Now, I have almost no responsibility or any authority here at UCO, right? My authority extends to sort of the confines of this classroom. What is it that I'm supposed to do? Well, I'm supposed to, UCO is supposed to provide you with an education. The institution itself can't do that. It has to act through professors. So I'm supposed to stand up here and teach you something, right? So, what are my responsibilities? Well, I shouldn't, engage in known lies to you. I shouldn't, I shouldn't lie to you. Now, it's not that professors always know everything, and it's not that we don't misspeak. We do from time to time, right? Textbooks, oftentimes I had a student write my student evaluations. I'm like, note this part in the textbook, it's just inaccurate. It's wrong. It's just factually wrong. one of the things, for example, that the textbooks historically have said in ethics is that the law is an acceptable moral minimum. Just wrong. It's just wrong. All of the textbooks say that. It's just wrong. Because the law itself may be immoral. But, you know, I mean, people think this, that you gotta follow the law. Right? Well, okay. So, you know, under this agency theory, the principal being UCO, I owe some duties to UCO. Well, historically, what were those duties? Well, they were the duty of loyalty, the duty of obedience, and the duty of thrift. Now, with regard to these duties, this one has become, from an ethics standpoint, very controversial in the contemporary world, and we'll talk about why that is. But historically speaking, and you can see why we had this, we're going to talk about the historical perspective here, why we had this duty of loyalty. Well, if you are acting as an agent for someone, if you are disloyal to that person, so for example, let's say you are, let's think of a relationship, an agency, a principal agency relationship that most of you all are familiar with. Historically speaking, that would be something like a real estate agent. Again, if you went back in time, now one of the things my mother did before she started all these bed and breakfasts was she owned a real estate company and a land development company. And at the time she owned her real estate company in Santa Fe, New Mexico in the late 1970s and early 1980s, you were either a buyer's agent or a seller's agent, generally. They had two types of agencies, buyers or sellers. Now you could be both, but that presented some challenges. Now, what they do in modern real estate law, as I understand it, I'm not a real estate agent, but as I understand it, what they say is the real estate agent is no longer a buyer or seller's agent. They're a transactional agent, which means that they owe a duty of loyalty to the transaction. But historically speaking, you wanted to sell your house, you listed your house with an agent, and they were the seller's agent. And then, you know, somebody else would come along and they would show your house maybe, and you would have two agents. So you'd have a seller's agent and a buyer's agent. This is just for historic. And of course, if we talk to Dr. Chapman, he's probably going to be horrified at my oversimplification of this, but I'm using it for illustrative purposes. So I'm a seller's agent. Let's suppose I list a house, right? What does that mean? It means that I shouldn't go out and try and work against my seller and try to negotiate a lower price so that we can just get the deal done with the buyer's agent. I shouldn't collude with the buyer's agent and say, look, you know, tell me, you know, behind the scenes what it is, how much your buyer is really willing to pay. Because, you know, I got a Maserati payment that's due at the end of the month, and I need to close this deal so I can make that payment. And the buyer's agent says, you know, well, my guy's only really willing to pay, you know, the house is listed for, let's say, $1 million. He's only willing to pay $800,000. And I say, look, I can get my guy there, right? I can get, that's, you know, $200,000. What's a cool $200,000 when you're talking about $1 million listing? And so, you know, I work with, why are you laughing?
I said 20%.
Yeah.
Like a lot.
That's a lot.
I don't
Yeah,
know.
but I have a Maserati payment.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, you missed that part, didn't you? Right? Like I gotta pay my, so, you know, like, you know, and you know, I could rationalize this by saying a bird in hand is worth, this is an old hunting expression, two in the bush. What does that mean? Like, you know, if you've shot the bird, you've got the bird in hand, it's worth, you know, because if you've got two out in the field, you know, you got to hunt them up, and you might miss, right? So a bird in hand is worth two out there somewhere is what we used to say. Now, when I used to use that saying, these sort of homely hunting analogies, students used to understand that, but anymore we have fewer and fewer hunters among my student population, which is just sort of surprising to me considering how much we love guns in this state. I mean, we really have a fascination with guns. Just love them. Lots of NRA members here, but we have fewer and fewer hunters every year. I don't know why. So anyway, you know, like I'm going to rationalize this by saying I got this buyer that's willing to pay $800,000. Sure, maybe we can wait for, a year to sell my $1 million home. But the buyer or the seller has, paid all of this money in interest that they're not gonna get back in that time. So, and I got this Maserati payment, so I collude with the buyer's agent to sell the home for $800,000 and sort of pressure my seller into that price. Well, this would violate the duty of loyalty. I have a duty to this seller to not do that, to not act in contravance of his interests. And that's fairly straightforward, and I think we can all understand that in this very simplistic situation. Right? I shouldn't go behind my seller's back. Now, it becomes interesting when, for example, you have more than one seller. Most real estate agents, and you will find this out if you go into real estate, you will starve to death if you only have one listing at a time, right? You're gonna have to have multiple listings. And so you owe that duty of loyalty to everybody that you have a listing with, and that can create conflicts. Now you can start to see how this would, if I have $2 million homes, it doesn't create a lot of conflicts. If, for example, let's say I have 5 homes under listing, and those 5 homes are all radically different. I have one that's $1 million. I have one that's listed at $500,000. I have one that's listed at $250,000. I have one that's listed at $100,000 and one that's listed at, like it's in the really poor part of town. It's listed at 75. Those are radically different markets of buyers that are going to be interested in that. And you're probably not going to get a lot of conflict. Realtors generally don't have that kind of spread normally. They tend to deal in similarly situated homes. For example, there's a whole little clique of realtors in the Oklahoma City area that deal in historic properties. And if you're selling homes in places like Edgemere or Crown Heights or Linwood or places like that, if you don't use one of those agents, they have a tendency to not show your homes. So you can have these conflicting loyalties, right? When you have multiple people. So we have this duty of loyalty, not to act in opposition to the benefits of the principle. A duty of obedience. Well, what is that? This one is less controversial from a moral standpoint. I have to do what my principal tells me. When I go out and I buy supplies, for example, when I was in high school and I would buy supplies for my mother for her business, I shouldn't be buying, I shouldn't throw on to the Sam's order packs of spearmint gum and Reese's peanut butter cups that I'm gonna then gobble down in the car on my way home, right? I should buy what's on the list and nothing more, right? That's not all that complicated or even difficult to understand from an ethical standpoint. Then finally, you had a duty of thrift. What does that mean? You shouldn't waste. You shouldn't engage in waste. So when I bought, when I would go buy stuff for my mother's business, when I was in high school and I would get supplies for her and things like that, she had a company car that I drove. Well, what would thrift be? Well, thrift would be driving, I go to Sam's once a week and go to the Chef's store once a week. Well, I should go directly to Sam's in the Chef's store and then back to the business. I shouldn't go off, 50 miles to go eat at Ishan's Chicken for lunch while using the company car and company gas. How many of you have eaten at Ishan's Chicken? It's extraordinarily good chicken, right? Exceedingly good chicken. But it's not located anywhere near Sam's or the Chef's store. It's located in Okarche, which is about 50 miles west of Oklahoma City. I shouldn't do that and then use company resources to engage in waste. So you have a duty of loyalty, obedience, and thrift. Well, as we become more complicated in these situations, these 3 duties, and looking at this narrow view of agency becomes more problematic. With regard to the duty of loyalty, for example, if companies are not loyal, should you be loyal in return? And how do we achieve that? And then we complicate it by things like codes of professional ethics. So as an attorney, I am bound by the rules of professional responsibility. Now, the legal code of ethics, unlike lots of codes of ethics, so lots of professions, for example, I sit on the city council in Guthrie, and we have a city manager. And the City Management Association has developed a code of ethics for city managers that are the way they're supposed to engage in the profession of managing city entities. These are people with enormous power who are not elected. As a result of the progressive movement in America, we ended up with municipalities moving away from what historically had been the form of governance to a new form of governance called the city management system. Now, one of the problems that we have is, since we think of ourselves as a democracy, we're not, but we think of ourselves as being a democracy, not a democracy. I mean, I can give you lots of examples of why we're not a democracy. We're a republic. We have a Republican form of government, and we have a Republican form of government in the Machiavellian sense of republicanism, or in the classical sense of republicanism. But we think of ourselves as being a democracy. One of the things that we've seen is something called the rise of the administrative state in political science and in political marketing. The rise of the administrative state. So what happened was, historically speaking, cities, like the nation, had sort of a model of governance where the head was an elected executive called the mayor, right? Now, most cities, including the city of Oklahoma City, the mayor is no longer the head of government. The mayor is not the executive officer like the president is the chief executive officer or the chief magistrate of our nation. The mayor is simply a member of the city council with one vote. He is the presiding officer of the city council, and you have an unelected city manager who runs the day-to-day operations of the city. Now, why is this problematic from a democratic standpoint? Well, now you've shifted all of this power away from somebody who's elected by the people to this non-elected person. And so with that power shift comes responsibilities, and City Managers Association has come up with a code of ethics. And you could put that code of ethics, I think, on one page. It basically says things like the city manager needs to be aware that they are, a non-elected representative, that it is the duty of the elected representatives to set the direction of governance. So as a city councilman in the city of Guthrie, what do? The mayor and the city council and we set policy for the city, we decide on the budget, and it's the job of the city manager to implement that. And he should follow our directions rather than doing what he wants to do on his own, right? So they have this code of ethics that says things like that, like don't go off on your own tangent and go against what the elected representatives have authorized you to do. With regard to the legal code, with regard to the legal profession, the code of responsibility is codified in a book that's about that thick. And it contains lots and lots of rules. So why does it contain lots and lots of rules? Well, because lawyers have an enormous amount of power. And having trouble with the PowerPoint today. So we have this code of ethics that is very, very thick, which now comes into contravenance of, in many instances, of this idea of agency. So as a lawyer, I oftentimes act as an agent of my client. And so what are the responsibilities that I owe as an agent to the principal? Well, one of those is the duty of obedience, right? And one of those is also the duty of loyalty. Now, those can come into conflict with, now that we've got lawyers in the picture, this idea of professional ethics. How can this be? Well, I owe a duty of loyalty to my client, which means that I shouldn't take on another client that has a conflict with that client and represent both clients. And that's fairly straightforward. But if we say that we have a duty of loyalty, how far does that extend? Can my client, for example, now, and this is one of the things that is problematic for Mr. Trump's lawyers, in that he has asked them or told them, it appears in some instances, among some of the allegations, to engage in things that are illegal behavior. And as a lawyer, you can't do that. And one of his lawyers found this out. His name is Rudy Giuliani, and he's been suspended from the practice of law for engaging in loyalty to his client. If we had unfettered loyalty to the client, what Mr. Giuliani did would not have gotten him in trouble with the Bar Association. When Trump said the election was stolen, this is not a political statement. Again, statement of fact. Like, Joe Biden won the election. By every objective analysis, there was no widespread voter fraud in the 2020 election. It didn't exist. Right? From a political marketing standpoint, Trump has said, now, like, this is interesting from a political marketing, because historically speaking, voters relied on the truth. And in the postmodern world, we've now engaged in an era where the truth seems to be fleeting. And it's rather interesting. Prior to Mr. Trump's presidency, nobody in the news would call the president a liar. All presidents have lied. They've all lied. Some knowingly and some not knowingly, right? But, in the past, before Mr. Trump, the news media, when the president was lying, which they all did. So, for example, and I knew it, I'll give you a Democratic example. Bill Clinton sat there, and when he was caught having an affair, he said, with his crooked finger on television, "I did not have sexual relations with that woman, Ms. Lewinsky," and I knew he was lying. And it turns out he was lying. But the press wouldn't say he was lying at the time. They said things like, President Clinton has a loose association with reality. They would engage in euphemistic talk about, they would say he has a passing familiarity with the facts.
Holy shit.
They would never say he was lying. After Trump, they just come out and say he's lying. It's a lie, right? So Mr. Trump has said that the 2020 election was stolen from him by widespread voter fraud. That is objectively not true. Mr. Giuliani, as his lawyer, went out and repeated these claims, and the Bar Association has said, you can't do that. There's these codes of ethics, and the lawyer's code of ethics is very, very thick. And one of the things that code of ethics says is you cannot, as much as your client wants you to, and as much as you think you have a duty of loyalty to your client, you can't lie on behalf of your client. Particularly, you cannot lie to the tribunal on behalf of your client. Filing cases that you know to be false is a violation of the rules of professional responsibility. You may have a duty of loyalty to your client. When your client says things like that, you cannot do that. You cannot lie for your client, even though they may think that you should be loyal to them. If you do that, the bar is going to come down on you and say, you can't do that. So we now, in this modern era where we have enormously complex situations, we now temper these duties of loyalty by things like codes of professional responsibility, which say you can't do that. My client cannot, for example, tell me I did it, get me off. and I'm gonna get on the stand and say I didn't do it. That's called a lie. I can't do that. I can make the prosecution prove beyond a reasonable doubt that my client committed the crime. I can represent somebody that I know to be guilty. I cannot put them on the stand and allow them to testify and lie. That's a violation of the rules of professional responsibility. Although in the strictest sense, if my client said, I'm gonna get on the stand and I'm very, I'm a psychopath and I'm very believable and I can sway people, and I'm gonna say I didn't do it, I can't let them do that. I cannot let the client take the stand. Which is why defense clients generally don't take the stand. Right? And it's also why defense attorneys generally don't ask their client, did you do it? Right? Because if I know that, I automatically can't put my client on the stand, right? So you have this tempering of these duties of loyalty by things like these codes of professional ethics. And in the legal profession, that has real teeth. You can't do it. You cannot engage. You also can't, that interferes with the duty of obedience. If my client tells me I did it, get me off and put me on the stand so I can say I didn't do it, because one of the things is that you can get a jury instruction. Nobody ever asked for this jury instruction. You can get a jury instruction because prosecutors cannot, if they do this, you get a mistrial. A prosecutor can't say, if he's innocent, why didn't he take the stand? But jurors think that, right? I mean, almost every defense attorney will tell you that if they can't put their client on the stand, they're on it, because people automatically want you to say, I didn't do it. And it's hard to convince. So you can get a jury instruction that from the judge that says, the fact that the defendant did not take the stand cannot be used against him. Now, that's not true in civil cases. Right? If a civil defendant, and this is one of the problems that Mr. Trump has in some of these cases, if a civil defendant gets on the stand, the civil defendants have to take the stand. There is no Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination in civil cases. It only applies to criminal cases. But if there is a possibility of a criminal case, they can say, I refuse to answer that question on the grounds that it may incriminate me. And in a civil case, you can get a jury instruction that says, you can consider the probative value of the fact that the client wouldn't answer that question on the stand against them, because the standard of proof in a civil case is a preponderance of the evidence, not beyond a reasonable doubt. So by not being allowed to put my client on the stand if I know they're guilty in a criminal case may violate these principles of agency that say I have a duty of loyalty and obedience to the client. So we temper these duties, this narrow view, with codes of professional responsibilities like professional ethics. Managerial responsibilities also present an interesting aspect of this conflict with general agency principles. If you have a corporate form versus a non-corporate form, what are your duties and responsibilities? Does that alter it? Well, if you have a non-corporate form, which means you have a partnership or a DBA, a doing business as, do you have more or less duties or responsibilities ethically than you do to the corporate form? Well, it depends, and it's context specific. So in a DBA or a partnership, for example, you're now dealing with an actual human being. Dealing with an actual human being may increase the amount of duties that you have versus dealing with a corporation. Right? Particularly if you're a duty ethicist like Kant. Right? You shouldn't lie to a living person. But a corporation is not a living, breathing human being. You have different loyalties, I think, if you have a corporate form versus a non-corporate form. of loyalty, obedience, and thrift. Because the stakes are oftentimes higher in the non-corporate form. There's a lot bigger risk in smaller entities than there is in a big entity, isn't there? And the impact of things can be much greater. And so there has to be a recognition of a degree of proportionality in these kinds of things. It also depends on where you are in the pecking order. Are you, in the pecking order of things here at UCO, I'm way down on the flow chart as a college professor. I didn't used to be. When I was in the Office of Legal Counsel, I was way up on the flow chart. I had a lot more discretion in things. I had control over large contracts in that office that I don't have as sort of a line employee as just being a college professor. Now I can tell you that having had those responsibilities, being the college professor is a lot better position, even though I'm way down on the flow chart from the Office of Legal Counsel. This is far more fulfilling a role than that job, which required a lot more. But, in that position, I had far greater responsibility to engage in thrift than I do, as a college professor. As long as I, sort of show up and I teach my classes and I don't, shoot any of you because you fall asleep in my class or you think I'm not funny or whatever. I mean, it's a fairly low bar as opposed to, having authority to approve or disapprove multi-million-dollar contracts. So it's relative. So what we used to think of as being very straightforward under this agency principal relationship, it becomes more difficult when you have more complex situations like you have in a large organization. One of the reasons why, going back to this duty of loyalty, let me go back one slide, has become controversial in the contemporary era is, historically speaking, employers and businesses had a sense of loyalty to their employees. Again, I think I told you the story. My grandmother was the classified records librarian for Sandia National Labs. She classified nuclear secrets for the Atomic Energy Commission. The way she got that job was her husband worked for Sandia National Labs. He died at an early age of a heart attack. That was my grandfather. I never knew him. He died when my mother was 6 years old. And the president of that corporation went to her and said, "Tunny, you have a job with the lab. Your husband was a good employee and we've got a position for you." And they made her the classified records librarian. Now, she was qualified for the job, but companies don't do that. If you work for Ford Motor and your husband has a stroke on the assembly line, they're not going to go to the widow and say, "We're going to guarantee you a job to replace your husband's income." Businesses used to do that. And in fact, in the 1980s, it became very fashionable for businesses to look around at their workforce and say things like, "We got a lot of old people hanging around here. And, they take a lot of vacation and they're sick and they cost us money in our health insurance. Let's get rid of them." And they would lay off old folks. This happened. There's a law against it. Companies still do this. They're not supposed to. There's something called the ADEA, which prohibits you from saying, "You're old, leave." Right? But they still do. How do they do it? Well, they have a reduction in force and they just don't replace at that level. There are ways, of getting around this. So corporations no longer have a sense of loyalty to you. Should you have a sense of loyalty to them? I think a lot of people would say no. Companies don't have any loyalty to me. Why should I be loyal to them? Is there a way that you can get around this through contractual rights? Well, I think there is. The answer is you might be able to get around this by having things like employment contracts. Businesses don't want to do that. They don't want to give employment contracts except to the top management for some reason. Then they're willing to give, contracts. But if you give somebody like a contractual right, maybe it would create a sense of loyalty in them. If they know that they have continued expectation of their job, they may increase it. But if you have no loyalty from the company to you, do you owe any loyalty to the company? Most ethicists in the modern world would say no, you don't. Loyalty should be a two-way street. If loyalty entails sacrifice on your part, and if the corporation is not going to engage in ethical behavior and providing you with a job and a continued expectation of employment, then you should be free to leave at any time as well. So I think you can get around this and you can get to it by giving people contractual rights. I have an employment contract with the University of Central Oklahoma. It's called tenure. It's a beautiful thing. And as a result of that, I feel some affinity to this institution that I might not feel if I didn't have that. Right? I mean, I feel like I have some sense of loyalty to this institution because I have this continued expectation of I have a job as long as I want. And as long as I can perform the essential functions of my job, which are not real hard. The essential functions of my job are get up and talk about what I want to talk about every day. And this is sort of fun. I get to stand up here and yap at people. I wanted to be a country and western superstar, but I'm a tone deaf flat baritone. So the way I get a captive audience is by becoming a college professor. Now I get to stand up and talk about what I want to talk about. I'd rather have a microphone and sing karaoke, but they won't pay me for that. So, I have this employment contract and it does create a sense of loyalty, I think. Whistleblowing is another aspect that comes into account. So what happened in Enron was there was this one woman who started noticing all of this stuff, and she went out and told government regulators about this. She became what's called a whistleblower. That violates your duty of loyalty and your duty of obedience, right, under this idea of agency. Because you're going outside the institution or the organization and you're telling people outside that there may be a problem. So this becomes controversial as well. What should you have if you're going to engage in whistleblowing? Well, first of all, let me tell you that one of the things that happens if you're a whistleblower is that nobody wants to hire you. It can be very detrimental. Now, the woman who blew the whistle on Enron has managed to make a career and a living out of writing about her experiences and by being a speaker on a lecture circuit, talking about the problems with Enron, WorldCom, and Tyco. But you don't make many friends when you become a whistleblower. So recognize that this can have bad consequences for yourself. So what do you need to have if you're going to engage in whistleblowing? You have to have a real threat. The threat cannot be hypothetical, according to most ethicists. This is an important point. The threat has to be an actual threat. It cannot be a hypothetical threat. You have to have sought to prevent the harm, and she did this. She went to people internally in the organization in Enron and said, look, you shouldn't be doing this. And the response of those people was, our accounting firm and consultants, Arthur Andersen, have said that this is okay. You can't just do this once. You have to engage in an exhaustion of remedies. So if your boss won't listen to you, what does that mean? So for example, I am hired and fired by the Board of Regents of Oklahoma Colleges, who have decided that their name is Rousseau, although in the Constitution of the great and sovereign state of Oklahoma, it's the Board of Regents of Oklahoma Colleges, but they've decided they're Rousseau. So, I don't know what to call them. I guess they want to be called Rousseau. We'll call them Rousseau. But they're the Board of Regents of Oklahoma Colleges. They're the ones that hire and fire me. But, the person who sees the day-to-day operations of the department is the department head. That's Stacia Work-Gray. So if I go and I say, like these things are happening, let's suppose I have a colleague who stabs a student with a pencil. That happened. I go to her and I say, this Professor X stabbed a student with a pencil, and she does nothing about it. Well, am I free then to go contact 4, 5, and 9 and get on the news? Well, most ethicists would say no. You need to then, say, like, if you're not going to do something about this, I'm going to go to the dean. So I go to the dean and I talk to the dean about it. And if he doesn't do anything about the professor who stabbed a student with a pencil, which that happened, then I need to go to the vice president of academic affairs. You need to go up the chain of command before you go outside. Just going, to your friend or your buddy is not enough. You have to exhaust your internal remedies before you become a whistleblower and go outside the organization. So conclusions, the meaning and value of work. Work is something that's enormously important because we're going to do this for the best years of our lives. We're going to be engaged in this activity during the time of our lives when we are the youngest, the strongest, the healthiest, right? Not the golden years, which turn out to not be so golden for most people. And as a result of that, we have to think seriously about the rights that we owe people that are vulnerable, that come to work and are in a vulnerable position because they rely on employment for their families and their communities. Those rights of employees also entail certain responsibilities that employees owe to employers. I would say the duty of loyalty as a result of contemporary practices has in many instances disappeared, particularly with regard to sort of lower level echelon employees, but that duty increases as you go up the food chain. If you become president of the University of Central Oklahoma, you have a far greater duty of loyalty, I think, than the person who is mowing the yard out here and doesn't have a lot. But there is a duty of thrift and a duty of obedience. So what does that mean? Well, when Stacia says you need to teach classes at this time of day, I teach my classes at that time of day. Right? I want to teach classes starting at 7 a.m. in the morning because I get up at 5. And she's told me that no one's going to take a 7 a.m. class and she's not going to offer it. When I first started teaching here, we had lots of people that took 7 a.m. classes. They were full. I don't know what's happened to you all. You've gotten sleepy.
I love early morning classes. I had an 8 a.m. accounting 1 and 2 class.
I think it's great. So I started at 8 a.m. I have like 5 lonely little students in that class because nobody wants to take it at 8. So I have to teach at times, that I would rather start at 7 like I used to. When I first started teaching here, we had a 7 a.m. class. That class was always full because we had all these working adults that would take classes before they had to go to work, and they could get in, 3 credit hours in. And they wouldn't have to be here at 7:30 to 10:10 at night if they did that. So I do what I'm told. I teach my classes what I'm told. The duty of obedience, and I don't waste resources. Now it's hard for me to waste resources because I have no purchasing power or authority. So I have a duty to not waste resources. I shouldn't be throwing the magic markers in the trash over there when they're still good, right? I have to throw a lot of them away because people take this duty of thrift seriously around here. They used to, when they first put these stupid boards in, we were so broke that they would give us one of these stupid markers a semester. You could, at that point in time, you could have left your wallet on the podium and one of these stupid markers and come back and your wallet would be there and the marker would be gone. That's how valuable these stupid markers were. One of the things that I think that we ought to think about, though, as marketers, and one of the things, is companies sought in the 1980s to cut workforces that were older and costing them what they perceived to be more money, is you're not encouraging people to live the brand. If you want loyalty in your employees, you're going to have to show loyalty. And from a branding standpoint, if you want employees to live the brand, if you want me to, show up in UCO branded stuff, and engage and talk about why it is that I think UCO is far superior to OU, which I do, in terms of the quality of education that you get. I think we provide a much better deal than OU. You have to have some loyalty in return. Companies that encourage living the brand do exhibit high degrees of loyalty to their employees, Southwest Airlines being one of them. So from a branding standpoint, I think, and from a marketing standpoint, we ought to think seriously about these things. That loyalty is a two-way street. And if companies want people to be loyal, they have to exhibit loyalty in return. There are companies that have done a very good job of this. Disney historically has been one that has engaged. People who work for Disney love Disney. Now Disney's gonna lay off 10,000 people, and those kinds of moves can create enormous amounts of distrust and can degrade the brand, right? That you've worked so hard to establish. So what companies should do, and I'll give you a modern example of this. One of the things that's happening is Microsoft and others are laying off lots of people because during the pandemic, they started hiring people even though they didn't necessarily have a need for them because they were afraid that if they didn't, their competitors would hire those people. And so literally for about 3 or 4 years, some of these largest tech firms were hiring people and they didn't have a whole lot to do, and now they're all of a sudden firing them. Maybe they should have thought about that in advance. Like, don't just be hiring people just to be hiring them because you're flush with cash. And think about whether or not you're going to actually be able to provide meaningful and valuable work to those individuals. That's about it for me for today. If you went to CSI, come see me so I can give you points. I don't think I gave anybody ducks today, but if you went to CSI, I'm gonna give you points for that, and I'm gonna put it on the duck hunt. So come and see me, and I will give you those bonus points for attending CSI.
I know.